having a professional museum and caring for a collection over generations is so important, is so crucial to a community that it needs to be a function of local government. So I went from, managing one site and say 20,000 people to now being responsible for, 50 square miles and 400 years of history. All right, so if in the 1800s half of our city was black, then half of the stories we tell about Lynchburg in the 1800s should reflect that history, should include those voices. Between 1840 and 1860, there were more enslaved people in Lynchburg than any other big city in Virginia. So in addition to the big national 250, we have our own very humble 50. There are a lot of people, maybe sour grapes, who say, well, we're better off for not having an interstate. And, interstate would have not been good for Lynchburg. But the reality was, at the time, everybody desperately wanted it, fought for it. So we have his original uniform he wore in the POW camp.
Do you really? Wow.
The shoes that he made himself out of the remnants of rubber tires. We were founded by Quakers who were abolitionists. And there was actually a man named John Lynch. And we've never had lynchings here in the city. And that's not who we are and what we're about. Historical resources are worth preserving, saving, defending, supporting, and making sure that local history always has support.
Welcome to another edition of No Holds Barred. I'm Rich Roth, and my guest today is Ted Delaney, the director for the Lynchburg Museum System. Ted, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, having me here.
Excited to talk with you. I mean, obviously, we're in the midst of the 250th celebration of the United States and doing a lot with the celebration of the Lynchburg and the greater Lynchburg area. And, Gemini and ChatGPT told me you are the foremost authoritarian on the history
don't believe it.
of Lynchburg.
Don't believe it.
And,
that's what they call an hallucination.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to get, but I mean, you've been working here a long time. Obviously, you went to EC Glass. I know you went to UVA. You came back to Lynchburg, but you were working at Old City Cemetery as a teenage volunteer. And when we were talking before today, I asked why. What was the appeal of that? As a teenager, to go and volunteer at the city cemetery?
Yeah, I've always been someone who loved history. So that's really why I got connected to that place. I also have to give a lot of credit to the woman who was the director at the time of the cemetery, a woman named Jane White. And if she hadn't been the director there, it had been such a gravitational force to motivate me, get me interested, to keep me there. I probably wouldn't have stayed there, would have gone on to something else. But she was looking for volunteers, and it was a place that was being rehabilitated. They needed a lot of help in terms of uncovering the history, giving tours, telling the story of the place and the people. And I was just in the right place at the right time, where she was able to give me the job there, find volunteer work for me to do there, give me the opportunity to help. And it's just an incredible place. If you've been there, you know it. If you haven't been, please go. The Old City Cemetery downtown Lynchburg. It's 27 acres and somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people buried there. All periods of history, all walks of life, all backgrounds. And I just loved being there, learning who was there, discovering their stories. Because for the vast majority of them, they are totally lost. There's no family left, nobody that remembers them in life. And so for people that live in Lynchburg today and live in this area, they're unknown, but have just really fascinating stories and are worth knowing. Yeah,
that was one of the interesting things, like, as we kind of talked prior to, doing this officially, was for you, it's really, the history's part of it, but it's not just learning the history. It's kind of helping to use the word uncover or discover the history, and that's a little bit of a different deal. You really like digging through and finding out things about people that maybe no one else knew, rather than just reading books on history.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of goes back to for me, the bigger theme of people in Lynchburg don't appreciate local history. They don't think there's anything special that's happened here. There's nothing that's notable that's happened here. People are often not very proud of the city and where they come from. And yet working at the cemetery taught me there are so many amazing people, amazing stories, things to be proud of, things to be inspired by, things to, help explain why things are, why my street is named that, why our city is the way it is. And so I've always felt like I could be that conduit, between that information and then people today, because it's new for most people. Mm-hmm. And then now at the museum where I am, I feel like I could do the exact same thing, but just at a higher level, maybe with a bigger audience, a bigger forum, because we now are responsible for the entire history of the entire city, not just that one place and that one subset.
Right. Talking about the dead people and the 15 to 20,000 people that are buried there.
Yeah.
That's a pretty wide range. We haven't found them all yet?
No, believe it or not, we are still uncovering stories. When I was there, we started something called candlelight tours, mm-hmm. and that's something a lot of people know. It may be the one thing they know about the cemetery, and it's a wonderful annual fall production where 5 or 10 different people buried there are brought to life by actors in first person, and their stories are told by lantern light at night. And we always used to joke that we could do new stories every year and never run out of stories to tell, never have to repeat just because there are so many, but we're still uncovering interesting stories, interesting people.
How do you do that? I mean, if you're not even sure how many people are buried there, how are you uncovering, not new people, but new stories about people and finding, oh wait, this person. How do you go about that?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a good example that just happened like a week ago. So I'm looking through local newspapers in the 1920s, trying to confirm who was the first president of the League of Women Voters here in Lynchburg. Mm-hmm. So as I'm going through these newspapers, I come across this series of articles that at the time was kind of front page local news, and it was about this mysterious man whose body was found in Fishing Creek, just found by, some kid one day walking around. And so there was this long, protracted series of stories about finding this body, trying to figure out who he was based on what was in his wallet and what was on his clothes. And then they eventually found out who he was, eventually found out he had been murdered by somebody who he had lived with because there was some drama with the woman's wife. And then the guy who murdered him was apprehended, tried, convicted, sentenced to 12 years in prison. It turns out that man, who was at first an unknown stranger, mm-hmm. and then ultimately found out to be this man named Otto Lindfors, is buried at Old City Cemetery. And he might have been on a list of people who we knew was there, but had no idea the context of his death and that story. And so sometimes just by serendipity, accident, coincidence, you find this backstory about somebody. And honestly, he's a great candidate for candlelight tours because of that. And, further interpretation in some way and maybe being put on the website. And that happens all the time where you just don't know the rest of the story.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the candlelight tours and how you choose the, 5 or so people that you kind of spotlight each year.
Yeah, so when I was there, which is now 7 or 8 years ago, we had a short list of characters that we would sort of accumulate over the years, mm-hmm. and we would just decide, this year, is there a theme we want to tell? Is there a way that these stories can connect? Sometimes it's based on casting. If you have a bunch of young white females who show up to be cast, it might be really hard to tell the story of an older African-American person, mm-hmm. Especially older male of color. So sometimes casting dictates it, but a lot of it is just, what the director, the production team is interested in and the story they want to tell. But we never ran out of options. And that was hard sometimes, choosing who you don't include.
I was going to ask, what discovery, what story that you found most memorable? And I'll ask that as well. But, what about, someone that you discovered or found that might be the most famous person that people would recognize, that maybe people don't know were from Lynchburg or certainly buried at the cemetery?
Yeah, so because this Old City Cemetery was a public burial ground, it really never had famous people.
Okay.
It was the place where kind of by default you got buried. So if you didn't have family, didn't have connections, didn't have money, that's where you ended up. So in general, there's really nobody who has any kind of national profile. The one that there are a couple, maybe they come close. One is the Congolese man named Otto Benga. I don't know if you've heard of that story. He was a native of the Congo, and in 1904 was brought to this country by a Presbyterian missionary to then be displayed in the St. Louis World's Fair as part of what they called an anthropological exhibit. Tragically, he ended up at the Bronx Zoo after that in a display in the chimpanzee house, trying to show at that time what they thought was the missing link between primates and humans. I mean, kind of horrible things that were just considered very acceptable at the time.
So this guy was basically treated like an animal.
Yes, and he was treated like a spectacle, for something for people to come and watch and see. And he was treated terribly. He was, taunted, and people would just do horrible things to him whenever he was in public. A group of ministers were able to get him out of the Bronx Zoo and ultimately placed him in Lynchburg, and he attended what's now Virginia University of Lynchburg here. But tragically, he just never really fit in here, always wanted to go back to Africa, but couldn't afford it. The timing was terrible. It was World War I, and got very desperate and ended up committing suicide, but was buried initially at Old City Cemetery, then was moved to White Rock Cemetery after that. But he's an example of someone who maybe he's on international radar in a way, but who's connected to that place.
So, and that kind of helps explain why you don't know exactly who's all buried there and how many people are necessarily buried there, because they were just burying people that didn't have the means or the family or whatever to take care of their own.
Yeah, and you can imagine, for a public cemetery, which, for people that aren't considered very important, like the record keeping is not great. The continuity between different caretakers over the decades was not great. Some records were just lost. We don't even know if they were kept. And so part of it is just because of who they were, record keeping was bad. And for most of the people buried there, we just know that they're there on the property somewhere, but have no idea where, because that was just never part of the surviving records. One other example of someone who's maybe sort of notable was a man named Josiah Holbrook, and no one has ever heard of him. But in his day, he was a very famous educator and sort of an inventor of equipment and tools that were used in classrooms. Like he would invent these models of the planets and the universe and planetary systems and other devices that were then manufactured and then used in schools and classrooms. He really believed in adult education and really promoted educating adults who maybe had never gone to school or who needed further education after they were adults and married and had children. And he was touring Lynchburg in the 1850s, studying the geology and the topography of this area, and accidentally fell from a bluff on Blackwater Creek, kind of like maybe near where the Hollands Mill Tunnel is, tumbled down, hit his head, fell into the creek, and he was out by himself that day, just, going up and down the bluffs. He was looking at the stones and the rocks. But so because he was alone, drowned in Blackwater Creek and died, and his body was found in the creek, he was buried at the city cemetery because he was not from here, had no family here. He's an example of someone who's got national recognition, national implications. He's got a Wikipedia page. He's in a lot of books about the history of education in the 19th century, and he's buried there. But in general, they're not going to be any famous names that we all know.
Gotcha. Ted, you spent, close to 20 years or so at Old City Cemetery before moving to the museum system. And really, we're going to talk a lot about not only the museum system and some of the different exhibits, and you have one that's just been rolled out on May 1st, kind of stage 2 of Vietnam. And we talked a little bit on the phone about David Harker, who's been a guest here and has an amazing story as a POW. So we'll dive into all that. But I mean, let's start with the history of Lynchburg, and really, really serious question that I think everybody wants to know. What are people from Lynchburg called? Are they Lynchburgers? is that really the term, Lynchburger?
Yeah. So historically, if you've got to pick a term, it's Lynchburger.
Okay.
It's not.
That's awful.
Lynchburgian. It's not Lynchburgite. Yeah, it does not roll off the tongue.
It doesn't.
I admit, but that's all we got.
It makes you hungry too.
Yeah, a burger.
talk about John Lynch. I mean, obviously, this town is named after him. The city is named after him. But a lot of misconceptions nationally about, what Lynchburg is all about. Obviously, there's Lynchburg, Tennessee with Jack Daniels. We get confused by that. People wondering, were there lynchings here? Talk a little bit about how Lynchburg got its name.
Yeah, so that's definitely a struggle we have in trying to raise awareness about our town founder, John Lynch, who was the namesake of the town, and also to reinforce that we have no connection to lynchings, horrible violence here. That's just not a part of local history. That has nothing to do with the name and who we are. But it's real, and there are a lot of people who are very frustrated by it, embarrassed by it. You wonder sometimes, does it make it is it a determining factor in whether somebody moves here, opens a business here? I mean, so it's a reality. So from where
is there a lot of that though, really?
So I hear a lot about it. Now, this is not scientific, but anecdotally, I have people tell me that they're embarrassed to put it on resumes. Really? I have people who say that they prefer their business. They prefer to have their address Forest or Evington or Amherst or Madison Heights rather than the word Lynchburg.
Wow.
I even think this is a theory that I have that I don't know that can ever be proven, but I think our present day Commerce Street was originally Lynch Street. And in the 1880s and 90s, it was renamed by City Council Commerce Street. And I think that had to do with a lot of businesses whose headquarters were on Lynch Street, just deciding that they didn't want that as their address. And again, for no good reason other than just the misperception and the stereotype of what lynching is. Mm-hmm. Because our town was founded by John Lynch, who was a Quaker man, a very devout man of faith. He inherited several enslaved people, but freed every single one of them in the 1770s, worked for many years to encourage other fellow Quakers and other neighbors to free their slaves. He advocated for abolition the rest of his life. There's a letter that's in the Thomas Jefferson papers that he wrote to Jefferson, encouraging him to meet with this abolitionist woman from Philadelphia. And he also was someone who believed in a lot of things that we consider normal and standard practice today, gender equality. In the Quaker church, he, like a lot of his fellow Quakers, believed that women had the right to run the women's business meeting and to determine discipline for women members. That was something at the time that was unheard of.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going back a couple hundred years, I mean, obviously a lot of this stuff, I mean, we had very different ideals and ideas of what was normal, right?
Yeah. So, for us, it seems like, oh, well, that's obvious. But
he was
in the 1770s and 80s, those were radical ideas. Yeah. And even, what people today describe as social justice, he really firmly believed that for people who had been enslaved who were freed, that there was a moral obligation to provide education for them and basic resources to help them make a life, make a living, learn how to take care of themselves. Not just to free them and then just let them, try to make the best of it. Mm-hmm. He himself was a pacifist, like all Quakers, so did not believe in killing somebody else. He's criticized for that, for not participating in the American Revolution, but speaks to his faith and how much he wanted to live the principles that he professed. He also was incredibly generous to Lynchburg and very civic-minded. So basically, anytime the town founders and town fathers needed something, like they needed land for a courthouse and a jail, or they needed land for what became Old City Cemetery, he would donate that to the city. Was always trying to do what would help grow his city, advance the city. He tried vigorously to ban the sale of what he called spirituous liquors in the city. So that's anything other than beer and wine. The General Assembly ultimately prevented him from doing that, so that you're not allowed to do that. But he was really trying to, what he said was to increase the morality of his city and the general welfare of his city. Someone with really good intentions. But again, so these are all, to me, really admirable traits and things that we can be proud of, but that gets lost.
It's interesting because you look at where we're at now politically, right? And, obviously, the spectrum's pretty wide where we're at right now. But, looking at it and you tell me historically, but I think Lynchburg, the Lynchburg area now is looked at as relatively conservative politically. But some of the ideas that you're talking about that the founder had would seem to be, I mean, it seems like he was kind of on both ends of the spectrum, both like socially trying to free slaves and, women's rights and all that back then when that wasn't accepted. You use the word radical and that was probably a good word. But then on the flip side, trying to, with the morality of it all. So where did he stand? And, is that different from where Lynchburg is today on the political spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. And I think it is what it is. He sort of embodied both of those things. In some ways, very conservative. He was also very pro capitalism, private sector, business strength. He was very entrepreneurial, started all kinds of businesses. He, as one example, when he realized that the rope ferry that he was using to cross the river could be more reliable and more profitable by building a toll bridge, he did that. He started a toll bridge company and he was the owner of it, and then built, therefore, a wooden bridge that was it was covered. So in all weather, you could cross the James River rather than having to be at the mercy of the weather and the water level in the James. So he's very much pro-business, capitalist, believes in, the free market and that sort of thing. And yet also has, at the time, very devout religious principles that show up in things like wanting to ban alcohol in the city and not wanting to take up arms in any way against anybody. And it's maybe hard today to reconcile that, but there were people in the 18th century who were like that. And he's a good example. And I think Lynchburg in general is a very moderate place. And there are times maybe when it veers to the left or veers to the right. But I think we always in general kind of land in the middle. And I think that's still true.
Yeah, it seems like there are definitely, when you look at it politically, and, you were telling me that just yesterday you had the pleasure of being in front of city council. But, there are definitely pockets of people that, live on both sides of the equation.
And it's hard today in the climate that we live in, where all of I feel like popular culture and the media around us is stoking extremism, partisanship. So it's just hard for everybody. And this is not just true of Lynchburg, but this is everywhere, all across the country. I mean, local governments are struggling everywhere for people to be civil to each other. Yeah. And it's real everywhere. But I believe in Lynchburg and that we'll get through this and, we'll find our way back to the middle.
Let's talk a little bit about the museum. You made the move. You wound up leaving the cemetery, Old City Cemetery, to come to the Lynchburg Museum. And you alluded to this earlier, but I want to get you to kind of elaborate on it. It really expanded your horizons as far as really being able to dig in and discover more about the history of Lynchburg, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I went from, managing one site and say 20,000 people to now being responsible for, 50 square miles and 400 years of history, and not just the cemetery, but all the other stories, all the other people, the places, the events. That challenge is something I've enjoyed and appreciated about my job. It's also been nice to be able to elevate some of those stories from the cemetery and some of that history and include that in the work that we do. Mm-hmm. And it's rare that we don't have a project that in some way connects to the cemetery, some of that original work. One example is we had an exhibit just before COVID and during COVID about the women's suffrage movement in Lynchburg, and it was tied to the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women getting the right to vote. Well, it turns out that the major suffrage leader or advocate here in Lynchburg was also an officer in the Ladies Memorial Association that took care of the Confederate section, the Civil War section at Old City Cemetery, and she was heavily involved there, and there are photos of her at ceremonies, and that was a big part of her life too. And there are some people, one of the first women of color to register to vote in the city is buried at Old City Cemetery, right beside her neighbor in life. They're buried side by side in death, neighbors in life and in death.
Wow.
They were among the first women to register to vote. And so that it was nice to be able to recognize on a list of names, oh yeah, those are people we've talked about before. Those are stories we've told. We can send people, go see their graves, go to Old City Cemetery, see where they are. So it does tie together, even though it's a much bigger challenge.
Tell me about picking topics for that you're going to, display as exhibits at the museum. I mean, how does that process work? Like we said, beginning Friday, May 1st, you guys rolled out part 2 of the Vietnam, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But tell me about the process that goes into it. What are do you come up with an idea first for something you'd like to do? Or, do you find, artifacts or pieces of history that you want to display first and then build it around that? What's the process look like?
Yeah, it's kind of all the above.
Really?
I mean, and part of my job is to try to keep my finger on the pulse of Lynchburg enough to know, like, what are people talking about? What are people interested in? What is going to be relevant for people? What is going to bring people to our museum? What is going to have them be engaged with us? A lot of it, honestly, is driven by major national or state anniversaries. I mean, this is very typical of just humans in general. We tend to get focused and interested in something when it's a major anniversary, right. But if it's the, 77th anniversary or something, it's not so much, but if it's 75 or 100, it's a big deal. So with the women's suffrage exhibit, that was really tied to the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. The Vietnam exhibit that we have now, that was prompted by the 50th anniversary of what is considered the unofficial end of the conflict, the fall of Saigon in 1975. So 2025 would have been the 50th anniversary of that. So a lot of it is tied to those anniversaries. We also try to figure out, like, are there other major state and national museums that are going to have a big exhibit that we can tie into or sort of complement in some way? And so just as one example, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, so the closest thing to a state history museum, they were going to do an exhibit about Vietnam in Virginia to coincide with that anniversary. And so we made the decision to do a local version.
So you'll kind of piggyback off other people to kind of keep the interest up and all that.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. And the idea is that it helps us. It's win-win, because in Richmond, they asked us, they said, do you have any interesting stories or artifacts that we can incorporate in our exhibit? And we worked with them to do that. And what that does is we hope in Richmond, it generates interest in Lynchburg and sends people to Lynchburg. And then likewise, we got a traveling version of their exhibit to come to Lynchburg to bring people to us who were here to see something from Richmond. So it's that really, there's a lot of, there's a lot of synergy is the word, I guess you'd say, from that. And it's really win-win for both of us.
Are there certain topics or subject matter that people in Lynchburg are more drawn to or find, I don't know if find more interesting is the right way to put it, but I know folks here are really, really supportive of veterans. The Vietnam exhibit obviously is going to be tied into that. We've got, D-Day Memorial right here. So, I mean, there's a lot of that dynamic going on in the area. Is that one of the things that you'll look at, is what people in this area are kind of drawn to determine exhibits? And what are some of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the museum has a board. We also have a committee of the board that focuses on community engagement and exhibits and that kind of public engagement. And so we always use them as maybe a focus group of sorts to figure out, like, what interests you? What do you want to see? Ask them what, do they think is worth talking about? Because every exhibit is a major investment. I mean, for our big exhibits, it's between 1 and 2 years of our time doing the research, gathering the artifacts, trying to record oral history, work with an advisory committee. So it's a major investment. So you want to make sure that it's worth it and that you're not just picking something random that I think is interesting, but nobody else does.
Right.
So we use the board, we use our committee. I think in general, I think it's fair to say that people here are very supportive of military history, armed forces, veterans, all of that. But it's not to the exclusion necessarily of other things. there was a lot of interest around women's suffrage. And, a lot of people just did not realize that women in the city couldn't vote until 1920. And there was a lot of interest in us helping tell that story to students in schools and to help create some curriculum for teachers to use. So I can't say that that's necessarily to the exclusion of other topics, but I know I was not there, but during the Civil War sesquicentennial, so from 2011 to 2015, that was the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, there was a lot of interest in Lynchburg about that and wanting to tell the local story, the local experience of the Civil War. But that maybe just was purely because of the anniversary and that there's sort of national interest and state interest. Just like there will be, whatever the next major war anniversary is, maybe the Gulf War, there'll be interest in that at the 50th.
You had mentioned earlier, the history of the name with John Lynch and, the ties to racism and lynching and, talk a little bit about slavery and, Lynchburg's role in that and, how big of a part of the history of Lynchburg was that?
Yeah, you have to admit slavery was a big part of Lynchburg's history before emancipation in 1865. We did a study that showed that per capita between 1840 and 1860, there were more enslaved people in Lynchburg than any other big city in Virginia.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it was mostly because of the fact that Lynchburg was a major slave market for dealers and brokers who were trying to get enslaved people to the farther deep south. So Lynchburg was sort of on the circuit.
So did that have anything to do with geography or,
Exactly. So it was where we were. We were sort of one of the last stops before you cross the Appalachian Mountains to go to the southwest. We're on the James River. We had railroad lines that terminated here. It's also because Lynchburg was such a major manufacturing center for tobacco. So a lot of tobacco products were made here in the 1800s, and that relied almost entirely on enslaved labor. It's very labor intensive, required, not machines, but people processing tobacco leaves and turning the leaves into plugs of chewing tobacco or pipe tobacco, that kind of thing. And so the combination of this being a market for slaves, but also having the need for that labor just made Lynchburg. It was a big part of the city. And one insight into this or key reinforcement of this is that almost every visitor's account of coming to Lynchburg mentions how many people of color there were here.
Really?
A lot of times they'll say one of the first things they noticed when they stepped off the train at the depot on the riverfront was all of these black faces that were around them, the number of people of color that were around the riverfront. The driver of the carriage that took them from the depot to their hotel was a person of color. The porter, all the people selling food on the street, all of these people involved in that experience of a visitor reinforced their presence here.
So knowing how important slavery was to just Lynchburg and the economy and all those different things, tell me about the transition once the Civil War was over, the slaves were freed, emancipation, the whole deal. How did Lynchburg react then?
Yeah, well, it was, number one, it made Lynchburg a major hub of Black life and culture after the Civil War because, number one, so many people were already here.
Right.
And then also it was just geographically, it was in the center of the state. And so there were 2 black colleges that were started here in the late 1800s. There was a black orphanage here. It continued to be a major industrial hub for tobacco. And then that transitioned into other things like shoes and textiles. And so for all those reasons, it was a major spot for African-American life. Now, that all came to an end in the early 1900s, 1910, 1920, because of several things. One, the tobacco industry moved to North Carolina. So all the processing, the transition to cigarettes, the transition to bright leaf tobacco, that whole industry kind of moved south, and the labor followed that. So the people left there. But it's also sort of the cumulative effect of Jim Crow laws, segregation, a disenfranchisement of people of color here, that all led to what's called the Great Migration, where people of color went to the north and they went to the west looking for better opportunities. And so for all of the 1800s, there was a almost 50-50 split in the population, black-white. So half of our city was African-American.
Wow.
But by 1920, it had dropped down to about 30%. And today it's about 25%. So there's kind of a sharp drop-off in the 19-teens and 20s. But that's a big part of who Lynchburg was.
Yeah.
And one way, we approach it is, all right, so if in the 1800s, half of our city was black, then half of the stories we tell about Lynchburg in the 1800s should reflect that history, should include those voices, should include those stories. And it's a different way to think about it than it has been done traditionally. Traditional history books, that's not obvious. You don't know that.
Well, the winners write history, right? Isn't that what they say?
True. That's right. That's right. They get to pick and choose.
They really do. But I had no idea that you talk about the slave markets and how big of an impact that really had in Lynchburg. And was there a lot of resistance to the emancipation in this area because of how big of a deal the slave camps and the slave trade and all that was here?
Yeah, I mean, you have to acknowledge that it was hard for people to very quickly change an entire way of life, an entire economy that's built around slave labor. I mean, that was a really hard transition for people to make. Some people were very bitter and angry about it for the rest of their lives. Eventually, though, people realized, this is the reality. And also people realized that there's money to be made here. And so there was a lot of northern investment in Lynchburg. People realized that, if you pay your labor and you pay them well and keep them happy, you'll get a good product. And people eventually came around and learned to adapt. But I know it was hard in the 1860s and 70s.
So, through that transition and through that change in the adaptation, talk about, how the economy of Lynchburg changed and what became some of the bigger drivers since the slave camps were no longer around.
Yeah, so Lynchburg did really well after the Civil War compared to a lot of places, and that was because Lynchburg was never burned or destroyed in any way physically in the Civil War, unlike places like Richmond and Petersburg and Fredericksburg, and also because the occupation here was very limited. So it was never occupied by the Union Army during the war, and it was only for 4 years or 5 years right after the war. So physically, Lynchburg had all these buildings and the infrastructure that were intact to help provide that foundation for growth afterwards. And again, people realized there's money to be made here. I mean, tobacco was incredibly popular. There were a lot of labor was cheap here. You could get very cheaper labor in the South than you could in the North. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people saw opportunity. And within a decade, by 1875 or 1880, Lynchburg really was doing well economically. It was a major banking center for this part of Virginia. A lot of industries here.
And the proximity to the James River obviously had to play a big role in that as well, right?
Yeah, James River, even more importantly, was railroads.
The railroads?
Yeah, and there were, I think at least 2 or 3 different railroad lines that terminated in Lynchburg, came through Lynchburg. And Lynchburg was really on better footing than a lot of places and therefore thrived.
Is it fair to describe back then Lynchburg as being like a major hub in at least Virginia, but certainly in Virginia, but maybe even the South?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are times when the local paper would call Lynchburg the Pittsburgh of the South or, a major industrial leader in the South. Absolutely. In Virginia, it was. Again, geographically, we're in the center of the state. We're well connected by river, canal, railroads. We had, a lot of labor here. We had, there were an educated population with schools and colleges. And I think the black high school here was maybe only the second or third one in the state. I mean, Lynchburg was really an important hub and center in Virginia. And I think you might say that it's less so now.
Yeah, I was going to ask what, because it doesn't seem to have that same, reputation, or maybe that's not the right word, but that same kind of impact that it sounds like it did back then.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of factors. One is just being outpaced in population by Northern Virginia and Tidewater, Hampton Roads. Those places just have grown so much faster than we have. Also, Lynchburg twice got lost out on some major infrastructure opportunities. So the first
64.
Yeah, so that's the more recent one. The first one was losing the Norfolk and Western headquarters. So back in the late 1800s, Norfolk and Western was looking for a place to put its headquarters and all of its rail yards and machine shops. There was a huge lobby for Lynchburg. Again, geographically, where we were the obvious choice, but they couldn't find enough flat land here to accommodate all of their needs. And so they chose Roanoke. And the rest is history for Roanoke. I mean, they took off in a way and they were a real boom town because of that. More recently, you're right, in the 20th century, losing Interstate 64 also really hurt Lynchburg. And it's not, in either case, it was not that Lynchburg didn't want these things. We tried, we lobbied, we pulled all the strings and all the levers, but just couldn't get what we wanted at the time.
So it sounds like there was a good reason that Roanoke got the railroad.
Absolutely.
Right, because of the flat land.
Yeah.
Was there a good reason we didn't get 64?
So from my interpretation of all the stories and the sources is that it was really political, that it had to do with the fact that a Charlottesville legislator representing Charlottesville was friends with President Kennedy. They'd served together in World War II. And ultimately, someone called in a favor and said,
okay,
we need this interstate to come. There were two routes. There was a northern route and a southern route. And they ultimately picked the northern route. And, there are a lot of people, maybe sour grapes, who say, well, we're better off for not having an interstate. And, interstate would have not been good for Lynchburg. But the reality was at the time, everybody desperately wanted it, fought for it, pulled all the strings they could. But it just ended up that I think was really more political.
The exhibits at the museum. You've talked a bunch about the women's suffrage one already. And I know you told me that was one of the ones that you thought was more impactful and really resonated with you. Now you've just opened part 2 of the Vietnam one. We referenced David Harker before, a POW in Vietnam from Lynchburg, still living now in Lynchburg. Talk a little bit about Vietnam part 1 and now what part 2 looks like.
Yeah, this was a topic, honestly, that I didn't know much about. Didn't know much about the local, story. But it all started with the 27 names that are on the Vietnam Memorial on Monument Terrace. So really focusing on starting with them, who they were, what their background was, their sacrifices. And part 1 of the exhibit was really focused on them, telling their stories, trying not so much to focus on how they died, but on what they did before that. So what were their interests before they left and went into service? Where'd they go to school? Where do they live? Just, basic things like that. And then we also acknowledge a lot of them were very highly decorated. I think the most decorated one had a total of 11 or 12 different medals and special honors.
Wow.
And so trying to acknowledge all that. Part 2 expands the story, and it talks about other things like the role of women as nurses in Vietnam and the role of Lynchburg as a place where Vietnamese were resettled. So it turns out, I did not know this, but there was a South Vietnamese general who was basically exiled out of the country for his safety. And he ended up in Washington, D.C., but his children were placed at the Presbyterian home here in Lynchburg. Wow. And so Lynchburg had 3 or 4 Vietnamese children who had to learn English and learn, American way of life right here in Lynchburg. They all went to public schools. They went to Dunbar High School or E.C. Glass High School. I think we followed them. I think one of them went to Ferrum College, and one of them, I think, went to some place in the D.C. area. Some of them live in the D.C. area now.
Wow.
So telling more of those other stories about Vietnam, trying to incorporate as many different artifacts as we can. A lot of incredible things have come forward. To me, the most amazing are the things that David Harker saved. So we have his original uniform he wore in the POW camp.
Do you really? Wow.
The shoes that he made himself out of the remnants of rubber tires. We have one of the bumper stickers that was used that was sold as a fundraiser to be able to buy him a Corvette, which he got when he landed
came back,
here. Literally for $1, this, you could buy a bumper sticker, and that helped fund the car. It was a 100% student effort by his classmates to be able to do this for him. Just incredible stories have come forward and interesting artifacts. All of this is going to get published in a book, which we're going to print it in the late fall and have it ready in time for holiday sales.
Okay.
And it's going to have all of the artifacts, the stories, the panels from the exhibit, anything that didn't get into the exhibit will be included, photographs.
Specifically for Vietnam, or
exactly.
Is this more?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so it'll be a book about the Vietnam exhibit, and it will include all the things that got included and extra stuff that just didn't make it into the exhibit.
So this isn't something that you typically do for all exhibits, though?
No, for a big exhibit like this, we try to, but it might only be once in 5 years that we do. It's traditionally called a catalog for the exhibit, but it's more of just like a book about the topic. And this has never been done. Like, no one's ever written a book about Lynchburg's experience of Vietnam. So this will be a first time, and it probably will be the last word on it for a long time. Because we're losing veterans, just like with World War II. There are fewer and fewer guys and women who are in Lynchburg who are connected to Vietnam, who have those stories.
Other exhibits in your time, and maybe even before your time, that really stand out to you as far as being impactful for the Lynchburg area, but just for general interest as well. What other ones, if there's one or two that really resonate with you still, what are they?
Yeah, one that I remember that had just opened when I was first hired was about aviation in Lynchburg and the history of pilots and airports. And I just had no idea till we did that exhibit, the really interesting stories of aviators who came through Lynchburg. One of the first female pilots and trainers of pilots, a woman named Lucille Kent, was from Lynchburg and taught all through World War II. A lot of men who then went off and served in the Army Air Force. There are men like Woody Edmondson and Squeak Burnett who were showmen who did like aerial acrobatics. There's a famous account of one of them flying a plane upside down underneath a ribbon or between two ribbons that were strung horizontally, and just incredible stories. The history of our own airport, I've been using our airport for 40 years, had no idea who Preston Glenn was. It's called Preston Glenn. It used to be called Preston Glenn Airport. Now it's Preston Glenn Field. Turns out he was the first Lynchburg resident aviator killed in World War I. He was, someone who was in Europe flying planes in a very, primitive way compared to today.
Right.
Was shot down and killed there. And so our airport honors him and that sacrifice, but did not know that. We had great pictures of the old circular terminal that I remember as a kid, but that's long been torn down in place of the new one.
I don't know that one.
To me, it was so cool. It was very it was a perfect circle, and it was very like space age, James Bond, Jetsons. I always loved it, and now it's totally gone. I think it's a tarmac now, but it was neat. It was nice to see that.
The museum's celebrating its 50th year.
Yes, this year. So in addition to the big national 250, we have our own very humble 50. It's hard to compete with 250.
I was going to say 50 is normally a big deal.
I know.
But when you're comparing it to 250, and you'll always have that problem.
I know.
But that was kind of intentional, right? Because you were saying that the museum really kind of started on the 200th anniversary of the country.
Exactly. So the whole reason we exist as an official museum system and as a professional museum is because of all the excitement around the National Bicentennial in 1976 and leading up to it. So there was a lot of interest at that time in having a professional museum in Lynchburg. There was no such thing. There was an all volunteer effort, but it was very sporadic. And, some days they might be open. Some days they might be, you might have a lot of trouble trying to learn about local history. So really specifically as a result of the bicentennial, we were established. And so we'll always have the sort of joined anniversaries. Our particular museum system was the vision of a man named Richard Gifford. And at the time in the 70s, he was the CEO of General Electric and the division that was here that made mobile communication devices and components. And at the time, that was the largest employer in the city of Lynchburg. So he was a man of real influence here. And when he was interested in something, a lot of people were interested in it. And he served on the Bicentennial Commission that City Council established in the early 70s. And he said, I think one of our signature projects needs to be the creation of a museum and then the restoration of the courthouse at the top of Monument Terrace, which is now our headquarters. It's our museum home. It's where our galleries are. And he was able to, he gave a lot of talks and a lot of slideshows and did a lot of lobbying to convince people that this was needed. And to make the case, which I appreciate so much now, that having a professional museum and caring for a collection over generations is so important, is so crucial to a community that it needs to be a function of local government. This is not something that you can just let, a group of private individuals handle and manage and expect that over decades and centuries that it's going to be cared for professionally, responsibly, consistently. And that's one thing that government does really well, is just a very baseline, consistent care over a long period of time. And he said this is something that government has to do. It's as important as schools. It's as important as public safety. And he convinced people that this was the right time, the right thing. And I'm grateful, because at other times it would have been really hard, and maybe the consensus would have been, no, we don't need this.
Ted, there's a book coming out, and you mentioned Richard Gifford, and he is one of the 250 people profiled in this book coming up. And he's a guy that, you wrote the story on him specifically. I want to talk about the book in just a second.
Sure.
But was that one of the reasons why you chose him, was his impact on the museum? Because I know he had a lot of other impacts, on Lynchburg. You mentioned GE and bringing communication to the city. I know Lynchburg College, brings in a speaker series kind of named after him. So he's obviously had a really tremendous impact on Lynchburg. Did you choose him for the book because of the museum?
Exactly. I just wanted to know more about him and who he was and sort of his vision, where he was coming from with this idea, because at the time, not everybody thought that Lynchburg needed a museum, that it needed to be a function of government, that, that this was an obvious thing to do. So I wanted to learn more about that. And I'm grateful that I did, because he was just such an interesting character. He was from New England. His father was an executive, with a major corporation in New England, long history of, doing really interesting things and traveling the world. Served in World War II, was a communications specialist for the Army, and then got really good at managing projects and people, and was noticed by GE, was ultimately made head of the division here. And even though I think he always was really fascinated by communications and the things that they were making and doing here, he also really loved history and really wanted, I think he felt like Lynchburg was a place that deserved a history museum, just like Richmond had one, just like Charlotte has one, just like Philadelphia has one. I think he saw what Lynchburg could be, what it should have, what he wanted it, to aspire to be. And was one of the few people who I think had the ability to communicate that and to win hearts and minds.
Well, the whole thing's been really interesting from my perspective, because obviously I'm not from Lynchburg, moved here later in life, and, kind of knew Lynchburg. Actually didn't really know Lynchburg very well at all. Just kind of, it's a spot down there. Oh, Jerry Falwell, right? Yeah. It's, that's Jerry Falwell's town. But, hearing how big of a really player it was regionally and nationally back in the day versus where it is now, I would think it's important for people to know that history, just because, again, Lynchburg, and this is not to, slam the city or whatever, but it just doesn't seem to be as big of a player as it used to be.
Well,
and it's interesting to learn.
Yeah, and maybe you could say it's a player, but in a different way. I mean, to me, it's interesting that the largest private K through 12 school in the state of Virginia is in Lynchburg. That's LCA, largest one in the whole state. The largest Christian university in the country is based in Lynchburg. I mean, that school and that campus and all of the connected enterprises really put Lynchburg on the map nationally and internationally. I mean, the number of international students and families that come to Lynchburg because of the school, that are connected to the school, it's really pretty incredible. So it's different than a way that it used to be.
Did Lynchburg used to be recognized as much of a religious type, and I don't know that I'd call it a religious city now, but what you're talking about with LCA and Liberty, obviously the religious aspect of that is huge. And I think, that's kind of a perception. Oh, it's a really Christian area. There are a ton of churches, and there are. Yeah. Did it used to be like that?
Yeah, no, that I think is new. And I think you could definitely attribute that to Jerry Falwell Sr. and what he and his family built. That's now Liberty University and Liberty Christian Academy. I can't say that before them, Lynchburg was known nationally for those kind of sort of religious values or for religion. I mean, I guess you could say that if you go back all the way back to John Lynch and you think about the Quakers that were here, I mean, they were leaders in the Quaker community in Virginia in terms of their influence and the work they did to try to convince other Quaker communities to free their slaves. And maybe that's sort of a quasi-religious thing that we were known for. But I think it's definitely different since the 70s and since Liberty.
The book. You've got the story and the profile on Richard Gifford. But there are 250 people from Lynchburg, and this is being done by the Potters in kind of honor of the 250th celebration of our country. The book will be out in July, honoring, like I said, or honoring or offering biographies of these 250 important people. Name of the book, I want to make sure I get it right, A Good and Pleasant Company. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was conceived by the doctors Clifton and Dorothy Potter, who are longtime local historians and authors and have published lots of books. And they said, I think actually both of them were on the city's bicentennial commission, the same one that Richard Gifford was on back in the 70s. And so they know, like at these moments, you do things like you publish books and you do these very special projects. So they had the idea to write 250 biographies, publish it, have it be a special signature project of what's now the semi-quincentennial, the 250. And now they granted.
Boy, there are a lot of those terms out there. You got to know.
It took me a lot of months to be able to just.
I mean, you're just rattling them off, and I'm sitting there trying to do the math in my head. And I'm like,
so it helped me when I realized that it's if you take quincentennial, which is 500, and then you add semi in front of it, which means half. So half of 500 is 250.
Okay.
So and that's apparently. According to Latin and Greek, you could say 250 a couple different ways, but the National Commission settled on semi-quincentennial, so that's one we're going with.
That's a mouthful. It's kind of like Roman numerals, it seems like, to a degree.
In 50 years, when we have another podcast, tricentennial will be a lot easier to say and
tricentennial,
to be able to speak to.
Okay. Yeah.
But until then, we're stuck with this very long wording.
So 350 would be?
So my guess is it would be septicentennial, which is half of 700, if I had to guess. But the Potters said, like this is going to be a really worthwhile project. We can do this, and so they are the editors of it, and they have written many of the biographies. But it's not solely their work because they got between I think 65 and 70 different authors to help them complete all 250 biographies, and so it is a really impressive collection of the personalities who made Lynchburg what it is. And it goes all the way back. I looked last night. The earliest chronologically is a man named Christopher Clark, who was the owner of the land that became Lynchburg before John Lynch turned it into the town. He also is the father-in-law of John Lynch. So John Lynch married his daughter.
Did they get along?
As far as we know, yeah. Yeah. No indication otherwise.
As soon as you say in-laws, there's always that question.
So we go from Christopher Clark all the way up to Mark Spain. Mark Spain is the most recent biography in there, and every person in between. So anybody who made something important happen here, who contributed in a special way, who started something that we still know about or use or see, they're all in there. And collectively, it's really impressive.
Rattle off some names that you can think of off the top of your head that people will recognize that they're going to have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about.
Yeah, so we just talked about Jerry Falwell Sr.
I would assume he made it.
Yeah, he's in there.
The question is, did Junior?
I don't think he did because they were trying to limit it to people who were no longer with us.
Okay.
So I'm sorry he did. He'll make it in the next book.
I'm quite sure he will.
Some of the names that we've already talked about, people like Josiah Holbrook, the educator who died here accidentally. Names like Anne Spencer is really famous, the Harlem Renaissance poet who's from here. Owen Cardwell, he was one of the first 2 students who integrated Easy Glass High School in the 60s. There's a biography of him. If you go back much, much farther, Samuel Miller is featured. He's the namesake of Miller Park and the Miller Home for Girls. A major benefactor of Lynchburg and Lynchburg institutions. Carrie Gregory, the first female lawyer in Lynchburg. That's an example of a name no one knows, but she was special in her day. She, as it turns out, was not only the first female lawyer in Lynchburg, but in the state of Virginia. First one admitted to the bar and licensed to practice law in the state. Queen of Stovall, the famous folk artist who's from Lynchburg.
And you said everybody in the book has already died.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. There's a 500-word biography about them that talks about their life and their accomplishments. There's an illustration that goes with each one. There's suggestions for further reading or more study if you're interested. I mean, it's really anybody and everybody, all different backgrounds, male, female, race, gender, religion, everybody. And
you were saying that that through some grants, these books are going to be given to the people in school systems.
That's right.
Here locally to learn more about the history of Lynchburg.
We got a very generous grant from the Lynchburg Community Foundation, the Greater Lynchburg Community Foundation, which will allow us to donate copies to all local schools, history teachers, make sure that they can have it as a resource to use in the classroom. It should be available to the public in June in time for the July 4th anniversary. A lot of people have pre-ordered the book, so they'll get it first. And if you just Google Good and Pleasant Company, Lynchburg 250, you'll find a website where you can go and pre-order it now if you'd like.
Talk a little bit about your vision for the museum and what you hope it can continue to grow and develop into, what you're working towards.
Wow, that's a great question. Ultimately,
what you're hoping city council will approve.
Yeah, well, that's, you're always making the case for why you should exist and do what you do. I really want people to be proud of local history, to be proud of where they come from, to be able to say in a conversation with family who maybe doesn't live here, we were founded by Quakers who were abolitionists, and there was actually a man named John Lynch, and we've never had lynchings here in this city, and that's not who we are and what we're about.
Yeah, you told me that the other day. We've never had that.
That's right. Believe it or not, lynchings, the actual, the violent act, are very well documented, and organizations and historians have done studies, and they will literally tell you every single one that's happened in this country. They'll tell you where it happened, when it happened, the circumstances.
Really?
And there has never been one in the city limits of Lynchburg. There have been a handful that happened in the counties around us. But people here in the city went to great lengths to make sure that didn't happen. And I think that's something we can be proud of. So I want people to be able to speak with confidence about that and about the city that they come from, and that we're not some horrible, awful place that you need to be ashamed of. And I also want us to be able to help convince people that historical resources are worth preserving, saving, defending, supporting, and making sure that local history always has support, that there's funding to make sure that we can preserve our collection, that our buildings like the courthouse and Point of Honor always look good, can, will be here for another 100 years to tell those stories and to give tours. Places like Monument Terrace are always well kept, and that people realize that these things don't just happen on their own, but it takes support.
Speaking about history and documenting it and preserving it, right, for people potentially generations down the road to understand, it strikes me that one of the things we touched on earlier, very briefly, but that the winners write history.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, as a historian, preserve it factually versus, or maybe not you specifically, but just, is there a process? Is there, like, how do we do that? How do we make sure that, what's being preserved and being, written down as historical is actually what really happened versus someone's version of it?
Yeah, well, I do think it's sort of a fallacy that you can preserve like the 100% absolute truth.
Right.
Because number one, sometimes you just don't have all of those sources that you need, or you might have a couple of artifacts, but you don't have all the artifacts. Mm-hmm. You might have a couple oral histories, but you don't have all the different perspectives.
And it's like a puzzle without all the pieces. It seems like where you're trying to say, well, I don't know exactly, but based on all these other things, is that kind of how it goes?
Yeah, exactly. And so you do the best you can right now to try to preserve as much of it as you think is important. And we constantly think about, like, what story do we want to tell the future about us today and about our past? Like, what is it that we're going to be teaching to kids 100 years from now about Lynchburg? And if you're not doing the work now to think about that and to be selective with what you're choosing to keep and save and the stories you're capturing, then you just have no idea what they'll be thinking and learning. Just as an example, it's very possible in the next 50, 100 years, a group of people will decide that the city needs to be renamed, that Lynchburg is just too much of a trigger, is too controversial. But if you can do the work of explaining who John Lynch was, who our founders were, then maybe that doesn't happen.
Yeah. As a historian and a guy who clearly is very interested in preserving it and what really happened, I'm curious to get your take on what we saw a handful of years ago with historical statues and monuments and artifacts, being taken down, and, whether it was because we thought we should be ashamed of them or whatever, they're still historical. Where do you fall on that?
Yeah,
being a history guy.
It was really hard, I think, for people in the history profession, because we are taught and trained to, like, literally stand in front of the wrecking ball to prevent things from being destroyed that are historical and from the past. And so the idea of tearing something down, melting it down, that's just, it sort of goes against the grain of the curatorial training that you have, because you're taught to do everything to preserve artifacts.
And even though you may not like a certain part of history, it's still history, right? And it's something to learn from or grow from or improve on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really believe in the power of things to teach, and that there's a story to tell about things. Now, I do understand that when artwork or monuments are in public places and when they are presented as sort of a representation of your community and who you are and what your values are, I understand that's different than when it's in a museum and it's in a gallery and it's got lots of context. And it's a decision that's way beyond me or museum people or historians, because it's really up to the community, and a community has to really be comfortable with what are these things that we are presenting as representatives of us and what we aspire to, what we believe in. And so that's something that only a community can decide collectively. And you can see how Richmond handled it very differently than, say, Lynchburg did. Nothing was taken down here. A lot was taken down in Richmond.
Right.
So there was a real tension between, like, preserving history, preserving the value of an artifact to tell a story, but also realizing that this is a conversation you have with a community, and a community has to really be supportive and be behind it. And especially when it's in public in a place that everybody sees every day, drives by, is on postcards, it's the face of your community. People have to be behind it, or else, you see where that goes.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm understanding where you're coming from, if a community decides, hey, we don't want that statue, we don't want that monument, you maybe take it and put it in a museum or something to preserve it historically because it was part of the history of that area, but maybe just not out in public. Where there's no context, as you kind of described earlier.
Yeah. There's a whole spectrum of ways to handle it. I mean, you can do nothing. You can leave it exactly where it is, but add context to it where it is. Mm-hmm. So you could put up signage, and you can add, virtual reality, augmented reality things around it where it is. You can add other monuments beside it so that there's sort of a dialogue,
a balance.
There. Yeah. You can relocate it to another public place that's maybe not quite as prominent as where it is now. You can relocate it indoors into a museum. Sometimes that's not practical just purely for structural reasons. Right. Some of these things are big and massive and heavy. And then all the way at the far end of the spectrum, there's the tear it down, melt it down, never speak of it again. And it's just a huge continuum. And you can see in our country how each community fell on a different place on that spectrum.
Gotcha. And just to follow up on my question a little while ago, looking ahead for the museum, plans, ideas, what would you like to see?
Yeah, so I hope that we continue to grow and that we can not only care for what we have, but we can collect new things and new stories and
does that mean
preserve
those. New building, bigger building, expanded building? What are you?
Yeah, I mean, we always would like to grow our storage space, make it more professional and accessible. We always would like to have more galleries to show off more things. One of our frustrations is that at any given time, maybe only a quarter of our collection can be displayed in public. The rest of it is in storage, and so we're constantly rotating things in and out of display. So we wish we had more display area, more storage area. We wish we had more curators and tour guides and could do more of the work of telling these stories. One thing we'd really love to do is help work with teachers to better connect students with this history, more field trips to our sites, for them to be able to talk about local history in the classroom. I mean, it's at least in public education, it's a real struggle just to cover like the national and the state history. There's almost no provision for local history. And yet these are the places that people live and work every day. Students, we just had R.S. Payne come to the museum for a tour recently. They work in a building that's called Robert S. Payne. Who was he? Why is there a school name for him? Right. And that's something I feel like they ought to know, they should know. And it's hard for teachers today to do that. And so we'd like to be able to, make sure that young people know about local history. They're proud of it. They can tell their parents maybe who don't know about it.
So it sounds like to do all that, you need more money.
We always need more money. The good news is that we are very much a public-private hybrid at the museum. So we have annual funding from City Council, and we always wish we had more of that. But we also have the Lynchburg Museum Foundation, which is a totally independent, nonprofit 501c3 organization. And we fundraise through them every year. We get grants through them. They're a wonderful support and augment what we do. And so this is not purely we need more money from local government or from taxpayers. I mean, we feel like that's a piece of the puzzle, but any support privately, by grant, any and all volunteer, I mean, all of that is helpful, and we are able to accommodate all of that.
And if folks wanted to learn more how they could get more involved, you would direct them where? So
maybe start on our website, lynchburgmuseum.org. You can always come by to the museum. We're at 901 Court Street, right at the top of Monument Terrace. Then call us, 434-455-6226. There are lots of ways to be engaged. Doesn't have to be financially. We always need volunteers and help.
Ted, thank you. This was really interesting.
Thank you.
Again, I'm not from here, so had the opportunity to learn a whole lot.
You talk like a native. You speak.
I know that's not true.
You speak about Lynchburg with a lot of backgrounds.
That's nice of you to say.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Ted.
Yep.
Ted Delaney with Lynchburg Museum. You're on No Holds Barred.